Hello and welcome to the podcast from Le Monde Diplomatique. My name's George Miller, and in this programme I'm talking to Philip Golub, who's Professor of International Relations at the American University of Paris. Philip has a fascinating article in the current edition of Le Monde Diplomatique entitled Curbing China's Rise, in which he looks at how Trump's trade war on China exemplifies a fear that China represents a fundamental long-term threat to the US. And, Philip tells me, that fear is certainly not confined to Trump's inner circle. Per capita GDP in China has risen from less than $200 a year in 1980 to over $9,000. That's a 45-fold increase over a period in which US GDP saw less than a 5-fold increase. So I began by asking Philip if China's meteoric economic rise conformed to a pattern of other nations before it, the US and Great Britain, for example.
The early industrializers, such as Great Britain, witnessed long phases of cumulative development of commercial society and then of industrial society, with all of the conflicts that generated domestically and internationally. But it was a long and cumulative process that unfolded over more than a century, leading to Britain's industrial, commercial, and financial dominance in the world economy at the end of the 19th century, in the latter half of the 19th century. Likewise, if you look at the United States, although the development was more concentrated in the second half of the 19th century, U.S. capitalist development or capitalist transformation occurred in an unfolding manner through a long process, cumulative process of growth and of investment. In the case of China, what we've seen is something which is much more time compressed and which is much more state-led than it was in the case of the early industrializers, in the case of Britain, France, or the United States, for instance. And it's comparable in many ways to Japan's industrial development, and it's extraordinarily explosive, actually. Japan's explosive industrialization at the end of the 19th century, and then again in the 1950s and 1960s. So we're talking about a very specific form of state-led development of late industrialization. It's what it would be called by the specialists of these kinds of transformations, of late industrial development and compressed development, which is state-led. That is not part of and does not fit into traditional liberal understandings, evolutionary understandings of the development of the capitalist economy.
And do you think there's been a misreading in the West, in that case, in thinking that China would perhaps adhere more closely to that classical narrative that that economic opening up would be accompanied by political change? Is that a fundamental misreading?
Yeah, I think that was a fundamental misreading. The assumption of most liberal analysts in the course, by liberal here I'm talking about classical liberalism, economic liberalism, not political liberalism in the American sense, is that China's incorporation into the world capitalist economy in the late 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s would ultimately create new space, social space, for a change in the structure of the Chinese political system and of Chinese society generally, such that economic freedoms, economic opening, and economic freedoms for individuals in China would translate into over time would translate into the emergence of a middle class that would make political demands for autonomy and voice. This has not occurred in the way in which Western observers assumed. Western observers, in particular in the U.S., but not only, assumed that China would be transformed through its incorporation into the disciplines of the Western-centered world capitalist system. That has not happened because there was an underestimation, I believe, of the importance and role of state-led development in East Asia, which goes back again to Japan at the end of the 19th century and to the East Asian experience more generally in the course of the second part of the 20th century. An underestimation of the role of the state and an underestimation of the way in which state-led development could actually be successful. In 1998, it's worth remembering, during the Asian financial crisis, or what was called the Asian financial crisis, Alan Greenspan, then head of the Federal Reserve of the United States, gave a speech in which he proclaimed the end of state-led development, and said that this would be a new era of free market capitalism, the victory and triumph of free market capitalism worldwide. It turns out, of course, that his prognosis was entirely wrong, that it was merely a transition moment in East Asia, which actually we are now seeing, as it unfolded, has led to China's reemergence as a major state capitalist power in the world economy.
So when and where do we begin to see a tension between the US's political ambitions and expectations vis-à-vis China and the economic expectations as embodied in the multinational companies that you write about? Where does that tension? Because for a long time it seems as though they were compatible. They were both sort of pointing in the same direction. And the ultimate, of course, is Trump, who expresses that sort of divide. So where does that begin in your view?
Well, in the 1990s, there was a kind of symbiosis, a compatibility between the aims of transnational firms and of capital generally who are investing in China, and the aims of politics, which are the aims of the U.S. state and of other Western states in particular, again, based on common assumptions about the nature of the transformation. Capital pursues its own interest, which is profit, of course,
yes.
and the political realm was pursuing its aims of reconfiguration after the end of the Cold War of the international political economy. So these aims were linked, and I cite in my article, Stephen Walt, a prominent realist international relations scholar, who in the 2000s pointed out quite clearly that the post-Cold War aims of the U.S. state were to reconfigure the world political economy to make it a more congenial place not only to U.S. power, but also to the development of a world capitalist economy that would fit into U.S. perspectives. The U.S. and nobody else really had anticipated at that time, and it was not really possible to do so, I don't think, in the early 1990s, that China would become the world's second largest economy by the end of the 2000s, and would become an industrial powerhouse of its own, because China appeared to be, at the time, in the 1990s, increasingly dependent on transnational capital flows, and it appeared to be locked into dependency relationships with foreign markets. China depended on the U.S. market, it depended on the Japanese markets, it depended on the European markets. And it did not look as if China would autonomize itself, become more autonomous in this process. Now, quite to the contrary, the idea was that its incorporation would lead to greater constraints on China rather than the contrary. Tensions begin to emerge in the mid to end 2000s when it becomes apparent that China is actually the state is pursuing a developmental strategy that is designed to lead to rapid industrial and technological catch-up. This was started under Hu Jintao and has been pursued since then with great intensity on the part of the Chinese state. For instance, the Chinese state obliging foreign firms to engage in technology transfer and obliging foreign firms to engage in joint ventures with local Chinese firms so as to make that technology sharing possible. So all of this led to, as time went on and as China's economic power grew and as its military and strategic influence grew as a result of that growth of economic power, led to growing tensions between the U.S. and China in particular, because the U.S. felt that China was becoming too big, too rich, too quick, and this materializes at the end of the 2000s in the 2011 pivot that Barack Obama announced vis-a-vis of China in the U.S.'s new Asian strategy, when Hillary Clinton in Foreign Affairs wrote her famous article, The Pacific Century. So the tensions grew in the 2000s and intensified toward the end of the 2000s, and now they've blown out into the open in a spectacular way.
Yeah. Now you say in your article, when Trump in 2016 was setting position anti-globalisation and what he calls Americanism, the expectation was first that he wouldn't be elected, and even if he were elected, that there would be sufficient curbs upon him exerted both by business and the political establishment that it wouldn't come to the position that we now find ourselves in. So what was it that failed? Why was that reading also a misreading?
Well, this is a very important point. Many of us assumed, I'm including myself within that, many of us assumed that even if Trump were elected, which we all thought was improbable, he would be constrained by the institutions and the way in which the United States developed international and transnational linkages all around the world after 1945, that existing prior commitments would inhibit any radical change or a radical shift from prior policy, which was an incremental policy, a more evolutionary policy towards China. The assumption was also that transnational economic actors, both finance as well as transnational firms such as Apple and so on and so forth, would weigh very heavily, because they did weigh very heavily, actually, in the determination of the overall policies of the United States in the 1990s and 2000s. So that the idea was that the weight of these two factors, both the institutional commitments and the power and weight of transnational firms, would inevitably create constraints on this presidency. It turns out that, and this is a point which is a theoretically important point, it turns out that there was greater actor autonomy than was previously understood in the structural framework. So even though structures do operate as constraints in international relations, social structures, there is a significant amount of actor freedom, and the political realm is actually potentially more autonomous than has been argued by globalisation theorists over the course of the past 25 years.
Trump has tested that and perhaps pointing it towards destruction. I wondered, if you look behind the rhetoric, because it's easy to be sort of dazzled by the rhetoric that comes from Trump. But if you look behind that, how profound an effect has his stance towards trade and with China actually had? I mean, what is really happening as opposed to what the the headlines are threatening might happen?
I think it's important to highlight the fact that Trump is certainly not alone in considering China today to have become too rich, too strong, too quick. Many people in the United States, in the national security establishment, significant parts of the Democratic Party, the leadership of the Democratic Party, the institutional leadership in Congress, agree fundamentally with Trump on his China policy. So there's a form of consensus that has emerged in the U.S. establishments, plural, that the China problem has become perhaps the overriding long-range, middle-range and long-range strategic problem for the United States. So Trump's rhetoric is his rhetoric, but behind that there is a larger consensus on this particular issue, even though there's no consensus on much anything else in the United States. And this implies that the kinds of tensions that we're seeing today, which are very significant tensions, are not going to disappear once Trump goes, assuming he does go. It means that they will persist in future because it has become a core feature of the U.S.'s understanding of its own challenges in the world in the 21st century.
So, I mean, that was really the next thing I wanted to ask you is, in inverted commas, is renormalisation possible after Trump, if we presume that if there's a post-Trump world in which he's no longer president, or what you're saying, it sounds like things have actually changed quite fundamentally. Yeah,
I think there has been a structural shift that has occurred in the relationship between China and the United States. It's possible, of course, to imagine, though not be terribly confident about it coming into application, some type of cooperative outcome in which China and the United States come to a kind of balance in which they both understand that the current conflicts are going to lead both straight into the wall. So there are people in China who argue that interdependence has to be pursued. There are some people in the United States who continue to argue that. But it's the dynamics of the new dynamics in world politics, which are the dynamics of nationalism and ethno-nationalism, seem to point in a quite different direction. I'm hesitant to make any predictions about the future, but I don't think that the current tensions are going to abate anytime soon.
Let me ask you finally, Philip, how do you read the way in which China is readjusting? How is it coping? What options do you think it has to adapt itself to this new relationship?
The Chinese leadership has been reacting in what I consider to be quite sophisticated manner in recent weeks and months. It has announced a whole series of highly technical measures that actually favor transnational capital inflows into China. It has liberalized. It's in the process of liberalizing the investment environment for international and transnational firms in the Chinese stock markets and the Chinese financial system. In other words, it's showing openness to transnational capital at a moment when it is in conflict with the U.S. state. So the Chinese leadership is showing by doing that they full well understand the growing contradiction and tension between transnational economic actors and the U.S. state over China, because the transnational economic actors in the U.S., of course, entirely disagree with the political leadership's conflict with China at this point. What Trump is doing, the Trump administration is doing, because I'm not sure Trump is doing much anything, what the administration is doing is deconstructing the linkages, the interdependencies, the global value chain, production and value chains that were set up over the past 30 years and that have become the core feature of the production system under globalization. So transnational firms' interests and the interests of the U.S. state, broadly understood, are no longer in harmony. Whereas the Chinese reaction suggests that what they're going to try to do is to favor the continuing interaction of China with these transnational economic actors to pursue their strategy of global economic transformation that has been so successful for them under their state-led policies.
I was talking to Philip Golub about his article, Curbing China's Rise, which is published in the October 2019 edition of Le Monde Diplomatique. It's also available on the website at mondediplo.com. If you're a subscriber, you can read every edition of the paper going back over 20 years, as well as exploring other resources such as maps, images, the podcast archive, and online exclusive content. And if you're not yet a subscriber, there's plenty of content online to entice you to become one, and full details on how to go about it. In the words of the late John Berger, why read LMD? To make sense of what's happening in the world behind the misinformation. I hope you'll join me again soon for another interview with one of our contributors. Until then, thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.